Welcome to the Catechism with Catholics Over Coffee podcast with your host, Jonathan Burnos.
Welcome to the Catechism with Catholics Over Coffee podcast. My name's Jonathan Burnos. I'm your host. I'm also the founder of the Final Summit, a small ministry in the Catholic Church. Final Summit Productions, we produce the Catechism with Catholics Over Coffee podcast. This is episode 1, the pilot episode. We're going to lay the framework down for what this ministry is. And I'm so excited. I hope you guys continue to come back and join us. This podcast is meant to be a resource for all Catholics in the Church that want to understand more about the why behind the Catechism. Why does the Church have all of these rules? What is tradition, and why is it so important? We here at the Final Summit, we believe it's the responsibility of the laity to teach and empower the laity of the Catholic Church. The role of our priests is to serve as the spiritual father within the Church. And we know right now we have a shortage of priests in the United States. We have a shortage of priests in the world. The numbers continue to decline. Now we need our priests to administer the sacraments. The sacraments are our means to grace. They're visible grace that's been established by Jesus Christ himself. They're an important tool for life change. What I've found through my journey, my reversion back to the Church, and I'll go into more detail about this in future podcast episodes, but what I found, some of the challenges that faced me were that the laity themselves, just the layperson in the Church, not always intentional, but oftentimes would chase away other Catholics or chase away prospects, those that were considering converting to the Church. Well, the Final Summit is a ministry devoted to building leadership tools, training resources. We're all about enablement. This podcast is just one tool to help talk about enablement of the laity. It's a transition from Virgil to Beatrice. And I'm going to explain more about this later. If you're familiar with Dante's Inferno, Dante's Purgatorio, and Dante's Paradise, then you'll understand my reference and kind of how some of the naming came about. We can learn from the Catechism, and we can use the sacraments. These are tools. These are grace available for us that we have to take advantage of. We should be using them in our life all the time, and the Church makes it available to us. Jesus makes it available to us. And so we're going to dig into that. We're going to talk about this toolbox that's a wealth of life-changing grace and how we can use this. Why the Final Summit? Well, where did that name come from? I actually took it from this idea of purgatory and the story of Dante's Purgatorio. So when I was a kid in college, I was fascinated with Dante's Inferno, really more on a scholastic level. I didn't really apply this to religion or my faith, but there was a poem, Dante Alighieri wrote Dante's Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradise. The poem was written in the early 14th century. It's actually an allegory telling of the climb that Dante makes up the mountain of Purgatory, and he's guided by the Roman poet Virgil. In the poem in Purgatorio, Virgil symbolizes human reasoning and classic wisdom. Virgil is, if ideally we could live our best life, we could be a good person, and we don't do bad things to people. We don't steal. We don't lie. We live our best life. Then Virgil is as good as we can get. So Virgil is here in Purgatory, which is really a Christian walk, a Christian place, and he's an example of as far as we can get without divine grace. And he's still in purgatory, but he can't go any further than this. So Dante's with Virgil all the way through this journey, except for the last 4 cantos. And in these last 4 moments before Dante reaches the top of purgatory, which is really the entrance to paradise, he transitions to Beatrice. And Beatrice symbolizes divine grace and theology. She is someone from Dante's past who he has affection for, he loves. And there's this transition period between Virgil, again, human reasoning, classic wisdom, into grace and theology. And this really resonated with me in my own life as at this time in college as I'm studying this text. I am Stoic. Stoicism is a big deal. Greek philosophy, the poets of Rome, all of these things are a way for enlightenment, a way that I can help raise myself to the next level by my own accord. This doesn't involve grace at all. And then as through life, as things come about, as I go through life change, some major turning points in my life, it causes me to open myself up to a belief in something, to go from agnostic to a theist, to believing in God, to believing in Jesus Christ as a Christian. So there's a lot in between there. But this is really my symbolic handing off of Virgil, the old self, into this Christian mindset, and my handoff to Beatrice, again, symbolizing this divine grace in theology. So allegorically, Purgatorio represents the penitent Christian life, which I now fully embrace. So in describing the climb that Dante discusses, he's talking about the nature of sin. He's giving examples of vice and virtue, as well as moral issues that we face in politics and within the church itself. The poem posts this theory that all sins arise from love, either perverted love, or they're directed towards others' harm, or it comes from deficient love, or the disordered or excessive love of good things. And again, I can see this in my own life. I can see this idolizing things and money and status on my own climb up this mountain. What I call sin, what I learned that's harming other people, it's also harming myself, that all comes from this perverted love of self, this disordered, disorganized understanding of what love is. And so everything is kind of rooted in that. I take responsibility for that. But then again, this is my own climb. And again, I realize this is part of the purgatory climb that Dante is facing in his poem. Over time, again, as I revert, and I spend more time as a Protestant Christian than I have at any other stage in my life. And going back to the very beginning, I'm baptized Catholic. I'm in the Catholic Church. My family makes a change. We leave the church. I go years, kind of in those formative years as a teenager into college, where, again, I take stoicism and I take on this form of trying to raise myself, by my bootstraps. And as I make the transition into a Christian, and eventually as I'm in theology and I'm learning about what it means to be a Christian, how do I follow Christ? Honestly, the pool is not deep enough for me. I have all kinds of questions that I have a hard time answering. And as I search for the answers, and I go and I search history, because I enjoy history, I search the church fathers, early Christianity in the first 3 centuries. And I realize that there's so much more wealth there. There's so much more truth there that I can dive into, that I wasn't even in the deep end of the pool. And so I revert back to the Catholic Church, which happens a number of years ago, just a few years ago, actually. So I'm still fairly new as a Catholic, but I'm on fire. I'm evangelical. I am passionate about what I believe, and I want to spread the gospel. But I have to come to terms with a couple things. I have to come to terms with purgatory, and I have to come to terms with our Blessed Lady, with Mary. And these are 2 very difficult topics as a longtime Protestant who's on fire for my faith and makes the decision that I'm going to step into Catholicism. And so as I struggle and I put those 2 on the back burner, finally I come to terms with Mary in a very special way. And again, future podcasts, we'll talk about this. But purgatory is also another area that I come to terms with. I make sense of it. And then once I make sense of it, I go back and I kind of explore Dante. I remember Dante from my youth. And I remember Inferno having such an impact, but Purgatory, the Purgatorio is not something that I'm real familiar with. So I go back and read. And as I understand Purgatory, again, I understand it as a process and not a place. Now, I think there's a lot of that misnomer again, where I think as a Protestant, in many of the kind of the fallacies of Protestantism around Purgatory, I think they come in part from Dante, from this experience, this metaphor, this allegory that's very visual, and it makes purgatory into a place. And we see all of these things happening to Dante in purgatory that help explain sin and vice. And so I can definitely understand as a Protestant where it comes from. But again, I go back to, as I learn what it is, I understand what Dante's really writing about. He's writing about a metaphor. He's writing about, again, an allegory that is meant to give a visual element to something that is a process. And it helps make sense of it. And I realize that we're all kind of making our way through purgation. Purgatory is a purgation of our sin. We understand as Protestants and Catholics that we can't go to heaven without Jesus Christ. He's the only way to heaven. So Jesus is part of this purgation. He is on our pathway to sanctification as a Catholic, as a pathway to salvation as a Protestant. And we'll talk more about that again in probably future episodes. But I realize that purgation can also happen in this life. A Protestant would say that we continue to be sanctified after salvation, once we receive Christ through confessing this with our mouth and believing it in our heart that we receive salvation. And there's a couple different takes on this theology interpretations, whether it's once you're saved, you're always saved, or if you can lose your salvation. We'll get deeper into that later, but I struggled with this for a while. But as a Catholic, I move into this other place where salvation isn't guaranteed. In fact, salvation isn't understood the same way by the early church as it is by Protestants and by many Christians today. So as I'm learning this, I understand that purgation happens throughout our life. And in addition, once we die, if we still haven't purged away these things that we try to take with us, and that Christ dies for and pays for, right? But sometimes we have a hard time letting go, that we still have to purge it. We can't enter heaven where God the Father is, and God is nothing impure can enter heaven, and God is pure, God is good, God is the embodiment of love. If we can just have that basic understanding of God. And so it completely makes sense as a Protestant, too, that nothing impure can enter heaven. Well, as a Catholic stepping into and understanding sanctification, understanding this purgation, then I know that I can only go to the Father through the Son. And the Son even tells us, as Jesus is carrying his own cross and suffering, that we must carry our own cross and that our trials might even be greater. All of that starts to kind of make sense, and it starts to ring true for me when I start looking at and understanding what purgatory is. And again, purgatory, I've said before, thank God for purgatory, for me, for understanding purgatory, the process. And so as a Protestant, again, we used the thief on the cross many times to kind of discount or move away from purgatory and say, well, this can't be, because here we have this person on the cross and he's a bad person. He's not baptized and he's with Jesus. And he says, Jesus, I recognize who you are. And, just please think of me when you go into your kingdom. He's recognizing who Jesus is as the Messiah, the King, as God. And we see Jesus saying, well, you're going to be with me in paradise on this day, right? Well, as a Protestant, that rules out purgatory. I mean, obviously, this guy's going to go straight to heaven based on his own faith alone. There's so much of the alones, the sola scriptura, sola fide, and that's really where I was living for a long period of time. And I move away from that and understand that as a Catholic, my perspective with the thief on the cross was, here's this thief next to Jesus, and he's going through his own purgatory. He's going through purgation there on the cross. I mean, what could be closer to following Christ, even in the last moments, even after he's lived his whole life, maybe not following Jesus, not being a disciple, not doing the things that Jesus tells us to do. And there he is in his final moments, and he takes his crucifixion. He's being crucified. Jesus was crucified. Just a horrible, morbid death, terrible pain. He takes all of this pain and suffering that he's experiencing along with Christ, and he offers it up to Jesus. He's saying, take this is my suffering. I deserve this, that I'm giving this to you, Lord. Think of me, right? And so there he's going through sanctification. He's going through purgatory as we understand it as a Catholic. So nothing's different for me. In fact, it just justification, again, as a Protestant, it takes place because of salvation. But as a Catholic, salvation isn't obtained in that moment. It's not a get out of jail free card. Jesus pays for our sin, but it's up to us to continue to follow him for sanctification to get to salvation, which happens later, right? This is the hope that we have, and we have it because of Jesus Christ. And so I begin my own spiritual climb years ago with Virgil, and I take the handoff to Beatrice in my own climb. There's that crossover, and I continue the climb up the mountain of purgatory, which is what we're all climbing right now. And that's where the name The Final Summit came from, again, for this ministry that we're launching. And it's attached to this podcast. So the CCC podcast that we're on right now, and yes, I did. That was intentional. Catechism with Catholics over Coffee, the CCC, is also intentional to be the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Or I can do some fun word plays with Catechism with Catholics over Cocktails. That might be the nighttime podcast. But this podcast is meant to offer a leadership training program. That's going to be the in-depth piece of this to help identify and enable small group facilitators and leaders that are in our communities, in our parishes, the local parishes. And we want to eventually enable the layperson to be a small group leader, to have some of the responsibility of helping small groups form and helping to sustain small groups moving forward. So we're going to equip them with a small group framework to help ensure the stability and the long-lasting goals of the group. So the main objective here, again, is to understand and apply sacramental grace into our everyday lives. We begin by focusing on the sacrament of marriage. That's at the heart of the program. It's the heart of the ministry. The sacrament of marriage is really the heart within the church itself. The basis for family and the model for small groups can be rooted in the sacrament of marriage. It ties directly into the mission of the church to spread the gospel. We use a program called Koinonia. Koinonia small groups. The framework is the kind of the second facet of services that we're going to provide at the final summit. Koinonia is a group word that means fellowship or communion, but in a deep, deep sense with God himself as like followers within Jesus Christ. So as Christians, it's a deep binding fellowship that's found in family. We see Koinonia become very prevalent in the New Testament and especially in the book of Acts as the infant church continues to grow rapidly through Koinonia. And the apostles of the church of Jesus are practicing fellowship through their teaching, and they're modeling the behavior that Jesus taught. And they're breaking bread with each other, which as a Catholic we recognize is communion, and the Eucharist is present. So we'll get deeper into that into the podcast. But Koinonia, it focuses on this very same framework that's built off of the sacraments that we see develop over time. We see reconciliation with each other. We see reconciliation with God, which is necessary. We see adoration of the Father, of the Son, of the Eucharist, which is the body, blood, spirit, and divinity of Jesus Christ. And we see serving and healing coming from this koinonia and from the sacraments. So honestly, every small group can operate efficiently if they were founded on these pillars, these sacramental pillars. And many of them have the same attributes and the same characteristics that koinonia gives us. It's just not found within non-secular groups. It might be found in secular groups and business organizations, but we can examine these characteristics. And so we know the framework works and we know where it comes from. The third arm of services is called Res Tantum. Res Tantum is going to be the heavy catechesis portion of the ministry. Res Tantum is made up of two Latin words that mean reality alone. The reality is the phrase that speaks of the grace of God. This is the presence of the Lord God himself. And without this presence, the elements of the sacrament, what comes from the sacrament, the evidence, the action that comes from the sacrament remains just physical. But with this element of grace that's applied, that flows from the sacraments given to us by Christ, they become these powerful tools that we need in our lives all the time, every day. We need to use these tools, this toolkit that God gives us through the sacraments that helps heal us, that helps fixes marriages, it fixes our homes, it fixes families, it brings families back together. It keeps people bound. It's amazing. And I've experienced with it. So Res Tantum is going to be our master class, where it's the graduate level course of learning the sacraments and understanding the catechesis on marriage. The goal here, of course, is to understand and use sacramental grace in our everyday life. We begin with the sacrament of marriage as it ties directly into koinonia and the family life. And the sacrament of marriage is at the heart of the church and the small group model. Well, I hope you tune in to future podcast episodes where we're going to continue to break down these mission services. I'm excited to get you involved. I can't wait to grow this into more parishes. I can't wait to introduce this to the clergy and to have some of our clergy be a part of the podcast themselves and help answer questions. They're going to be a part of making sure that we're enabling and catechizing each other, the laity, to the best of our abilities. The show itself is going to be a great resource to really just plainly speak on teachings. My goal is to be, if we were just to go out into the neighborhood and we were to, meet at a restaurant, meet at a coffee house, have a drink, and just have a casual conversation about these things that apply to all of our lives, to build that koinonia, that friendship that we would do with a close friend or a family member. This is the goal of the Catechism with Catholics over coffee. This is the goal of koinonia. This is the goal of Res Tantum. These programs I'm super excited about to launch. So we have a website, visit thefinalsummit.com, check it out. You can also fill out the contact form. If you're interested in more information, we have books here that we're going to make available soon. If you're interested in more information on how to bring this into your own parish, I would be happy to come into your parish and speak about this to the leaders in your church, to talk about bringing this program in to help train and enable leaders within your own parish to start this program and to continue it. Again, Grassroots, we're just kicking it off. Super excited. Please check out the website. Let us know if you're interested. Just connect with us on social media. Connect with us through our email newsletter so we can continue to give you information and talk about the growth of this ministry. So can't wait to get you involved. But, bare minimum, check out this podcast. We're going to try to make it entertaining. I can't wait. I love podcasts in general. I love Catholic podcasts. So I can't wait to make this personal, talk about our journey together, talk about some fun stories that I learned along the way. I'm a big Catholic geek. Big nut, and I love Our Lady, so we're going to bring her into quite a bit. So, well, thank you guys for checking us out. We'll catch you next time on episode 2, or it could be 001B. I don't know. I haven't decided how we're going to break this out yet. So thanks for joining us. Catechism with Catholics Over Coffee. I'm your host, Jonathan Burnos. We'll see you back next time.